Brian is a programmer and software testing consultant. He came to Snowbird as a representative of a part of the software testing community that's been developing a testing style, emphasizing exploration, lessened reliance on documentation, increased acceptance of change, and the notion that a project is an ongoing conversation about quality. His being an exploration of what Agile testing might mean and how it fits into Agile development. Congratulations to those who have realized that I just read the script. Well, I hope I was doing good, but I read the script that I found on agilemanifesto.org, and Agile Lithuania volunteers had been organizing Agile tours since 2009. And all I can say, we are slowly going through the list of Agile Manifesto authors, inviting them to our conference to share their passion for Agile and sometimes to steer us so we stay on the right path of our Agile journey. So Alistair and Ari has been with us already in previous years, I would say even multiple times. And today, my excitement cannot be overstated. Brian, it's an honor to have you joining us today. The stage is yours. Take it away.
Okay. Is that sharing?
Yes, now looks good. Yeah, you're all set.
Okay, might as well get started. I don't usually introduce myself, especially when somebody just did, but there is a fact you need to know. I did come into the meeting that wrote the Agile Manifesto as a representative of the testing community. After that, I became yet another Agile consultant. The important thing that I think you need to know is that I actually had my last consulting engagement in 2013 in the Czech Republic. So it's fair to say that I am out of touch with what's currently happening in Agile. That is to say, I stay in contact with the experienced Agile people that I've met along the way. I don't anymore have close contact with people who are starting out with Agile, and I have practically no contact at all with how people outside the Agile community develop software these days, because a goal of a lot of us in early Agile was to make Agile popular enough that we could work the way we want with people who like working in that way, and the rest of the world can do whatever they want. So once we achieved popularity with Agile, we just went into our little world and haven't looked that much outside it. But the impression I get is that the various mistakes I'm going to talk about are still relevant to people today. So let me actually get rid of your faces if I can find my cursor. Whoops. Well, let's see. There you go. Okay, the impetus for this talk is from this quote from a book called Systemantics, which is, in order to succeed, it is necessary to know how to avoid the most likely ways to fail. That is to say, you need to know not only what to do, but what not to do. So this talk is going to concentrate on the negative, which is appropriate for someone who used to be a software tester, software testing consultant. The quote, by the way, is from this book called Systemantics by John Gall. It's been through multiple editions. It's about how systems work and especially how they fail. I like this book a lot. It's written in a strange style that other people may not look, but I do recommend taking a look at it, browsing at least the first few pages and seeing if it's a book you like. By the way, I'm going to recommend some things to look at in this talk. The final slide is going to show all of them in one place so that you don't have to scurry and write things down. While I'm doing recommendations, back when I was a consultant, and I would fly around and do training, mostly in things like test-driven design and such, I would carry with me the first edition of this book, The Art of Agile Development by James Shore and Shane Warden. And there's going to be a second edition of this book coming out next month, I believe. And I think I can, without having read it, I expect it will be a worthy successor to the first book, which is the book that I thought was the best single book introduction to Agile software development. So give a look to that book as well. So I'm coming from the point of view that Agile is largely about reducing the consequences of being wrong. So for example, if you develop a feature and the feature ships and nobody likes the feature, the customers hate it, the users hate it, the Agile, in a properly functioning Agile project, the response would be, we can change it and we can make use of most of the work we already did. So this is not a big disaster. We don't have to rip things out and do a lot of work that's wasted, because we've engineered the product, the code base, such that it can be changed relatively simply. Similarly, if it turns out there was a design that was satisfactory early in the project, but over time, as the project's changed or as the company's scaled up, that design is no longer good enough. In a proper Agile project, you won't have to shut everything down, produce nothing, rip out the guts of the system and put in a new, complete new system behind it with no obvious work happening during however long that takes. Instead, you should be able to gradually mutate, change the design toward the desired new design, while still being able to deliver new features at frequent intervals, the way Agile teams like to do. You might do it more slowly, but you can still do it. Or final example, if there's a team member who's hit by a bus and dies, that shouldn't be a disaster, because there's not a single person who knows or owns any part of the code. Instead, it's owned by the team and someone else has worked on that code. So it wouldn't be a disaster. So it's really about resilience. It's really about reducing the consequences of being wrong. So when making changes to an Agile project, you want to think, is this making us more resilient, or are we doing this for some other reason? If it's another reason, that might not be the best. Okay, so I'm going to go through various mistakes. These are not in descending order of importance or anything like that. They're grouped into roughly 3 categories, the first of them being technical. I happen to feel very strongly about this mistake, which is why I put it first. There's a quote here: the Agile methodologies are methodologies created by people who like to program. That was said by Pete McBreen a year or 2 after the writing of the Agile Manifesto. And what he says is not entirely true. Of the 15 people there, not all like to program, but I'd say 11 of them were people who like to program. And in fact, were people, a lot of them were people who made their living doing program. And Agile had been systematized, put together as ways that these people who like to program wanted to be able to program, how they wanted to be able to work in teams. And it was really about producing a working environment for these people who sit at the bottom of the organization chart, sit at the lowest level of the hierarchy of the organization. And so what these people had to do was sell the ideas of Agile from the bottom up. That meant programmers had to convince other programmers, let's give this a try. They had to convince testers, let's give this a try. They had to convince their boss, let's give this a try. What they generally didn't have to do was they didn't have to convince managers of managers or bosses of bosses of bosses. This came in down at the bottom, and the idea was it would gradually move its way up as individual teams had success with Agile. Now, in this day, back in the beginning, a thing called XP, or extreme programming, was the dominant methodology of Agile. And it was dominant, I believe, because it directly addressed all of these constituencies. It had things to say to programmers. In the early days, it had less to say to testers, but it had things to say to testers. It talked about team scale organization. It was designed for teams of 6 to 12 people, thereabouts. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if half of the people who are listening to this talk had never heard of XP. And that's because today, the vastly dominant Agile methodology is Scrum or some variant of Scrum. And there are two reasons for that. One is the Scrum people hit upon a clever marketing idea, which is certified Scrum Master, certified this, certified that. There is a high demand for certification, and they filled that demand. The second is that Scrum is tailored to be more appealing to the people I'm calling managers of managers. It addresses the kinds of concerns that these people have: the organization of people, the tracking of progress, budgets, how you organize meetings, essentially organization of people and resources to produce products. What it does not address are the programmers and the testers and the other people. And there's been a strong trend over the past 20 years to simply not talk about programmers. And as somebody who said I couldn't use his name once said to me, modern Agile, as it's typically taught and practiced, doesn't admit that at some point in the proceedings, someone competent has to write some damn code. Now, in the early days, if you talked about the fact that Scrum was missing technical practices, the answer, which is a good answer in theory, is that Scrum is about self-organizing teams, and the self-organizing teams will self-organize to choose appropriate practices for the team, the problem, the product, what have you. And the expectation was that the kind of technical practices they would choose would essentially mean they would be picking up the XP practices or the extended set of XP practices like the ones that James Shore covers in, I'm sure, both of the editions of his book. The problem with that theory is that most teams didn't do that. Most teams didn't feel empowered to spend the time or the money to get good at the kinds of techniques that they need to be good at in order to do Agile successfully. Therefore, it's a safe bet that a large proportion of you listening to this talk are working for organizations that are underinvesting in technical skills, and that is a serious mistake. Before I go on, let me point out two things. One is there's a little box up that I can't see on my screen now, but it's a box with a number in it. The box is gray because I'm talking about technical things. I'll later be talking about business-wide things and management mistakes, business-wide mistakes. And the number there is the countdown to the last of the mistakes. The other thing I'm doing is, as I was making these slides, when the topic of the slide reminded me of someone, I put their name on this slide. And the reason I'm doing that is because people like me who get invited to give keynotes in talks, give keynotes in conferences like this, the reason we're known is because we collected lots of ideas from other people, wrote them up if they weren't written up, made them available to people, showed how these different ideas hung together into something you'd call a methodology. So we're really more like reference librarians than, Einstein inventing something new. But we tend to get most of the credit. So I thought I'd just put names on here of people who really deserve more credit probably than people like me. Okay, in the slide before this, I possibly came across as picking on managers, saying, oh, all they care about is meetings and budgets, not about the real work. To make that up to any managers of managers in the audience, I'll now pick on programmers. I'll pick on people like me. But first, a small digression. The thing that you're looking at here is what's called a needle holder. If it's used by surgeons. So if you're a surgeon and you're sewing someone up, you don't grasp the needle directly. You use a needle holder to hold the needle, and then you move the needle, not touching it, with the needle holder. My wife, before she retired, used to teach veterinary students. She was professor of veterinary medicine. She used to teach students to use needle holders. Veterinarians do that. Human doctors use that. Needle holders are very common. They're awkward to use at first if you've spent your whole life using a regular needle, but in medical schools, the students are trained to believe that their professors know what they're talking about, so they uncomplainingly, or only complaining a little bit, go through the process of learning how to use a needle holder until they're good enough at it that they understand why not using a needle holder is more inefficient, is dangerous, so on and so forth. Now, I want to contrast the virtuous modesty of vet school students to me. Around 1999, I was first introduced to test-driven design. I had written a book in 1994 that was about programmer testing, teaching something that was my testing practice as a programmer tester that was not test-driven design. And when I first heard about test-driven design, which was on the very first wiki, which was created for discussing things like patterns and agile practices, I, speaking from my experience and position of expertise, explained why test-driven design couldn't possibly work, why it would fail. And you can still, if you go to, I think it's wiki.c2.com, you can still see the arguments I had on the wiki. At some point, I was convinced to actually go and try test-driven design. to write a project using test-driven design. And based on that, I realized my reasoning from my past experience, my reasoning from first principles about how test-driven design must work was in fact bad reasoning. There are some things you cannot understand until you learn how to do them. You can't view them from a distance and really understand them. And that is true of test-driven design. It's true of a lot of Agile practices. So the good thing about me is it took me something like, it's been over 20 years, so I don't remember, but I have this vague impression that I wrote about 5,000 or 20,000, those two numbers come to mind, 5,000 or 20,000 lines of Java code before I really got test-driven design. So I had to persevere in the same way that medical students have to persevere to use a needle holder. It is a characteristic problem of programmers, maybe everybody who works on software, that if we don't get instant gratification, we decide something isn't worthwhile. We don't stick it out, or we argue about how something is impossible before having actually tried it. So I do that. The reason why a team's technical practices may be weak might not be because they weren't given enough time or money to practice, but that they simply chose not to practice. And that I want to claim is a mistake. So a typical result of this mistake in an Agile project is you start out at some point with a certain baseline level of productivity. A key Agile practice is releasing shippable software at frequent intervals, or sometimes potentially shippable software at frequent intervals. That discipline alone produces a burst in productivity, which often is very exciting to new Agile teams. But what happens is at some point you plateau, which may seem okay because every technique, every skill plateaus after a while. But then what happens is productivity starts dropping. And maybe in the worst case, productivity drops even beyond the level you started out with. And one possible reason for that is that the team simply doesn't have the technical skills to write the kind of software that can be modified continuously to release features. Often that's a lack of technical skill. Sometimes it's overconfidence, not quite the right word, but it's so exciting delivering pieces of software to the business and the business being happy with it, that you want to do it as much as you can, and you go faster than the capability of your team can sustain. You take shortcuts, you leave little messes behind in the code with to-do statements saying to-do, refactor this, so on and so forth. So if you suspect you're having this problem, what you need to do is you need to go slower. You need to be extra meticulous as you're going along. When you find problems in the code, places that are awkward, you have to stop, need to clean them up. You need to discuss that kind of thing with the whole team, form a team consensus on what good code looks like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The slogan I like to use is that if you want to get fast, you have to start slow. So consider that if your programmers are starting to have that annoying little niggle that things aren't just right, I tend to ignore those too long, and I usually end up regretting it. Okay, so talking about the business, one mistake you might use is to choose Agile. For example, here's a case in which Agile may be inappropriate. You're working in a startup. Your goal is to hit the market fast. Your goal is to hit the market, have a lot of features, capture the market, get bought by Google. In that case, Agile is probably not appropriate for you because over the relatively short period of time you're looking at, Agile will not be competitive in producing features with basically hacking something out and leaving the problem for Google to fix after they acquire your company. Google's got plenty of money, they need to do something with it. Or similarly, something that I've seen that has caused disaster on Agile projects is you have an executive who is moving up the corporate hierarchy. He or she gets a new project. His or her goal for that project is to have a big success for this project, have that big success within a year, move on to the next higher position in the corporate hierarchy, and forget about that project. That person's interests are not served by Agile because in that period of time, they can force out more work than an Agile team can. Agile teams are about the long term. They're about getting things right in the long term, about producing the right features over the long term. It's not an appropriate process for people with short time horizons. Another mistake is what's sometimes called the feature factory. Agile is great at pumping out many small, relatively self-contained features at a relatively high rate of speed. Now, the problem with that is kind of the basic problem facing all software, which is that by and large, people don't want software. I don't want to use an app. No, if I had a person who knew me well, was able to understand what I say quickly and easily, I would want that person, I'd want to say, go do the following for me, and the person would go off and do it in a way that satisfied me. The only reason we use software is because people are too expensive. So we make do with second best, which is software. And feature factories are not, they are the worst of software because they don't have a coherence to them that allows me, the user, to be able to do what I want swiftly and efficiently without wading through a lot of menus and screens and such like things. Feature factories are tempting. My hunch is that feature factories are often due to having a weak product owner. That is, a product owner who really does not have decision-making power over the product. In a sense, a product owner who is in fact not the owner of the product, but someone who takes orders from a whole bunch of different stakeholders throughout the company who all want their different, somewhat incompatible things out of the software. And often a weak product owner doesn't understand the business well enough to push back on that and produce a synthesized whole. So that is a classic mistake. I want to call this the classic mistake of the weak product owner. Better, whoops, jumped ahead of myself. Another common kind of failure is what I call the product owner or Scrum Master as boss. Sometimes product owners are people who used to be called project managers, and they're told, congratulations, you're now a product owner, go own that product. Or the Scrum Master used to be a first level manager, and the company says, oh, we're a self-organized, we have self-organizing teams now, so they don't need you as a manager. You can be the Scrum Master, which is supposedly meaning that you are the master of the Scrum process. And the temptation in both of those cases is for the product owner or Scrum Master to revert to being the boss. And that is a mistake, because self-organizing teams are important. They're hard to create. It's easy to fall back into the habit of having a boss. I was visiting a Scrum team, something like 2002, and Mike Cohn was the product owner. And while I was visiting this team, this was a successful Scrum team. I wasn't there as a consultant. I was there really to learn from them. And they had had some problem in production, and they were going to have a team meeting about it. And they had the team meeting. Everybody walked in. Mike Cohn, the Scrum Master, walked in, and he very ostentatiously opened up a newspaper. That was a thing they had in 2002, newspapers. He would open up the newspaper and he'd start reading the newspaper. And I thought that was odd. And I talked to him or someone else about it later. And what he was doing there was saying, I'm not here as Scrum Master to solve your problem, team. You, team, have to solve the problem. I'm here to help you if you say, we need something done, but I'm not here to solve the problem for you. And that sort of thing, I think, is very important. So a lot of places fall into teams with bosses. A good sign of this is when you're doing your daily stand-up, and this is really back in the day when everybody worked together in the same physical space. But if you're doing a daily stand-up and you're standing around and people are going around and saying what they did yesterday, what they're going to do today, any issues they have, who are they talking to? If you have the case where everybody is talking to and looking at the Scrum Master, you have a situation without a team. You have a boss with people working for him. Better is a good product owner is a very wonderful thing. They really do own the product. They really do understand the business. They're empowered to make decisions. It's a super wonderful thing to have such a person working on a team. The problem with that is that such a person almost certainly has the hardest job on the team. They are the most likely to be overworked. They're the most likely to burn out. And as such, they are a single point of failure. So it's useful to take some of the workload off of the product owner by having the entire team understand the business, understand the users, understand how customers work, understand the overall vision for the product. So if the product owner misses something, the team is able to say, wait, I don't think that's what one of our users would actually want. They probably, let's think about whether they want something more like this. And that can be a very powerful thing because we don't like single points of failure. Another mistake is, I don't know anything about the Baltics, really, in the Baltics than Poland. Nowadays, generally when people in software talk about teams, it seems they're talking about temporary collections of individuals who are temporarily together on the same project for a shortish period of time on their way to moving on to something else, never to worry about that project again. That's not a team, that's a collection of individuals. Teams are things you can seriously talk about as a unit. It takes time for teams to become stable and effective. If there's a lot of turnover, you don't get a real team. In a real Agile project, you should expect low turnover. You should make things so attractive in the project that you get low turnover, so that as each person leaves the team, they leave the team at a slow enough rate that they can be replaced by a new person without major disruption to the team. So working conditions need to be exceptional to keep people on the team. Another mistake is large-scale estimation. People used to come to usually some team leader or project manager. The business would come say, we need an expense accounting system. Here's a long list of the features we want. Can you do it in a year? And there's not really any good answer to that. There's possibly the answer, there's no way we can do it in the year, and that's most likely a valid answer. But an answer, yes, we can do it in a year, is sort of pointless. It's a fact of life that in software, we can't estimate things out in a year with any degree of accuracy. Nobody likes that. It's just the way it is. You have to live with it. The way you live with it in Agile is to say, your list of features, we don't know if we can do it, all of those things in a year. We are sure we can do enough that at the end of the year, you will have an expense accounting app that you can ship, people will pay for, it won't embarrass the company. It won't be perfect, but it will be the best expense accounting app you can get from this team in this amount of time. And you know it's the best because you get to tell us what things to do first, what things to do next, and you get to change your mind if reality tells you to change your mind. So that's the honest answer. Sometimes companies don't like the honest answer. They want to be lied to. Jeff Patton has a really excellent workshop case report that he wrote a long time ago, and it talks about how he finessed a fixed scope, fixed cost, fixed time project to do it in an actual Agile way. It's a very nice paper, so I do recommend it. Small scale estimation. Early in Agile teams, you'll often have teams that get stories, feature requests, and they carefully break those down into different programming and testing tasks. They assign estimates to that, and then they roll those up to an estimate for the whole feature, and they track the estimates and they measure their velocity, and it's so on and so on and so forth. And they use Fibonacci scale or power of 2 scale or all sorts of things about estimation. And by and large, those are a waste of time. It's not bad for a beginning Agile team to do the breakdown into tasks so they get good at being able to figure out the scope, the size of a story. But in a well-established Agile team, what you expect is the product owner to come in, say something like, okay, the theme for this next iteration or sprint is this and this and so, and here are some possible stories that work toward that theme. And you talk through the stories fairly briefly. The team gets together and they say, we think we can do this pile of cards in the next iteration, and that's done. And that converts horrific day-long product sprint planning meetings into short little pleasant meetings that are honestly as accurate as the very detailed estimation. So that's really just a ritual that doesn't really add value, at least for a good Agile team. Final thing is scaling Agile. Martin Fowler gave a talk, I believe this was around 2003, and the title was something like, Scaling Agile is the last thing you want to do. And that's a nice thing because it's a nice saying, last is an ambiguous word in English. It means both, the last thing is both, partly it means the worst thing, as in, I wouldn't marry you if you were the last man on earth. That makes, you are the worst person possible to marry. It also means final. So scaling Agile is hard. Hard things are to be avoided as long as you reasonably can. So the message from Fowler and the people at this workshop he was talking at is, do what you can to reduce the size of the problem rather than increase the size of the team. And that is, I believe, the last of the mistakes. Here are the recommendations, and I believe there is time for questions. I hope that someone is there.
Yes, Limonas is there,
Yes,
but he is having some troubles.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Yeah, Brian, thanks a lot. Very, very interesting presentation, very interesting points, and we have quite a few questions. So why don't we just get started? The question that collected most of the votes is about prioritizing technical work over, and by the way, I can easily relate to my own context with this question. How to prioritize technical work when the product owner is focused to deliver more and more features. So basically commercial product features over the technical work that needs to be done as part of it.
This is part of the skill issue. A skilled and experienced Agile team, I believe, can most often continue to deliver features while doing the technical work as part of that work. So the idea is something like, your code base has this design, it needs to have this new design, or this area needs to be cleaned up. The team agrees in the direction they want to go, and then they perform what amounts to a large-scale refactoring in small steps while they're doing feature level code. So there's a feature, part of that feature intersects with part of the work that you need to do for technical reasons. Do that part of the work for technical reasons. You're working on some code, there's a problem that needs to be, there's code that really needs to be cleaned up. If you're going into that code to implement that feature, take the time to clean it up. So you're essentially dividing the work among, you're dividing the work up among feature stories, doing a little bit with each feature. That's hard to get good at, but the alternative of, oh, we need to take time apart just to do this technical work is, as you can tell, it's difficult to convince people once they're used to getting features that you need time off to do some technical thing. More generally, there's the matter of getting permission to do technical work. I like to think, trying to think how to put this tersely, the interaction between the team and the product owner is a personal human interaction. In some sense, the product owner is protecting the team from the chaos of the business, which is always changing its mind and changing priorities and doing all sorts of things. And the product owner is there to make the team, to give the team a stream of work that they can do the work without being jerked back and forth. So that's part of the job of the product owner. In return, the product owner is given by the team these nice little features to show to the business to say, see, we're doing things you like, keep paying us money to do those things. So the product owner is gifting the team room to work properly. The team is gifting the product owner success to show off. In a team that has that personal relationship where they realize both are working for each other's interests, it's okay. It becomes okay to say to the product owner, we just don't see any way to do this technical thing we need to do without taking a whole iteration to do it without any features being developed. And the product owner will say, okay, I trust you, go ahead and do that. So the answer, uncomfortable as it is that this amounts to developing a sense of trust between the team and the product owner based on successful delivery of features that builds to the point where you get permission to do the things that you need to do. It's not a great answer, but it's the answer.
I guess that the whole reasoning, or let's say the background for the question, and again, it's just my assumption, maybe depending on my own context, sometimes business is very pressing on timelines, like deliver faster. So this is where probably we can no longer say it's just part of the feature. I even know situations where teams are asked to do a small hack, which we can fix later just to release earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Any reflections on that kind of situation?
The answer is sometimes. So if people are being unreasonable, you have to tell them they're being unreasonable. And really, in a Scrum project, it's part of the job of the Scrum Master and the team really, to push back against that with whatever means you can. And if you can't do that, you have to threaten to quit. There's a story that Ken Schwaber, one of the originators of Scrum, used to tell about his favorite Scrum Master. This was a woman who, she was the Scrum Master for a team. The team had what we sometimes call in the US, I'm sorry, the company had what we sometimes call in the US the furniture police, that have strict rules about moving furniture and stuff. The team wanted an office space with whiteboards around it and desks facing each other so they could pair program and do that sort of thing. And the furniture police said, no, our standard is cubicles with such and such and so and so. And so what the Scrum Master did was came in over the weekend, rearranged all the furniture into the shape the team wanted, sent an email to everybody involved saying, I've rearranged the furniture because the team is what's important here, the product is what's important, and they need this. And if you want to rearrange it back, well, I'll come in the next weekend and rearrange it again. And the only way you're going to stop me is fire me. And she got her way. Ken Schwaber, who told me this story, says he's done similar things and been fired. So at some point, if you can't change the way your company works, you have to change to a different company.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Thanks for sharing, Brian. All right, next question is, isn't Scrum itself, to an extent, to blame for many of these mistakes that you mentioned?
Yes. To the extent that, so as an old extreme programming person, sure. Scrum has devalued technical work. Scrum has fed into the idea that's very common in the United States, that I associate with the Harvard Business School, with the slogan that a good manager can manage anything, that a manager doesn't have to understand whether they're making toilet paper or software. Scrum feeds into that by the way it downplays the technical work. And to that extent, it's to blame for that. I think it's also true that Scrum has, through its, I hope Scrum still does this, is it still 2 days to become a Scrum Master, a certified Scrum Master?
Well, there are probably more people and better people than can answer this. I assume yes. There are different certifications, and I see Daniel is nodding the head. So yeah, that's probably the case.
That's way too little time. And to the degree that it presents the idea that hard skills, like being a Scrum Master, like organizing retrospectives, like doing stand-ups well. Jason Yip has a 20-page document of patterns on different variations of stand-ups. There's a lot to this stuff. And Scrum has perpetuated the notion that it can be easy. And so people come to it not realizing how much learning work there's going to be. So Scrum used well is perfectly fine, but it does lend itself to being used poorly.
Thank you. Next question is about scaling. I remember you spoke of scaling and that it's one of those mistakes we should not do or we should not make. But a lot of companies are doing it for many reasons. And the question is the following. So what is the most classic mistake leadership can do when it comes to agile scaling? And again, probably the question is about leadership. So not the technical staff, not product owners or scrum masters. I guess leadership is people who take decisions.
I'm going to refuse to answer that on grounds of I'm not competent to answer that. I have very little experience with scaling Agile. So if I were to say something about it, I would just be making it up.
Fair enough, Brian. I guess audience appreciates your honesty here. So we can move on with the next question. The next question is how to deal with a situation where a product owner is actually a boss or a manager. You spoke of situations where it should not be, but you know, sometimes just it's the case. So what would be your advice?
Is that this is the product owner?
Yeah, in this particular question, it is a product owner, but I do assume there could be cases where a Scrum Master is a manager as well. So it has two hats, a manager hat and the Scrum Master hat at the same time.
Well,
you can comment on both.
So there are lots of roles that a manager can play. For example, a manager should be concerned with the career growth of their employees. Managers should have, one-on-one meetings to talk with the employee about that sort of thing, performance reviews, what have you. That kind of management is fine if it happens to be the same person doing Scrum Master, doing that kind of management and being the Scrum Master, that's fine. The key thing is thinking about two things at once here. The key thing is the product owner is about what needs to be done, not about how it's done. The product owner doesn't assign who does what to which story, which feature. That's the team's decision. The product owner doesn't say how long it will take to do something. That's the team's decision. So there are those boundaries of authority. And I think it's good to have it stated explicitly that the team is responsible for how, the product owner is responsible for what, the Scrum Master is responsible for understanding Scrum and for doing things like threatening to quit if they don't get, standing up for the team. The Scrum Master is there as a servant to the team. Now, once you have that understanding, if people disagree with that understanding, we're kind of back to the first place. They pay your salary, they can tell you to do something, but you don't have to do it. And in a really good team, the whole team together will push back, and a whole team pushing back together, that can be a fairly powerful force. One of the things, so I'm sort of annoyed listening to myself, but because it sounds like what I'm saying is you just have to be strong-willed enough to push back, which is easy for me to say because I don't even have a boss. So yeah, I can say push back against your boss. But one of the things that's not recognized well enough is that Scrum used to be the Agile method that pushed back the hardest. In a way, Scrum, early Scrum, took on the personality of Ken Schwaber. And Ken Schwaber used to be a sailor in the Merchant Marine, and he was, I assume still is, gruff, tough, the kind of guy that, if you meet him in a dark alley, he's going to smash a beer bottle and cut your throat. And when he talks about his early Scrum projects, people would come to him and say things like, well, let's slip this one new feature in so we get it out at the end of this iteration and we'll make it up later. And he would say, no, if you want to do that, we're going to throw away all the work we've done so far in this iteration. We're going to revert back to the beginning. We're going to do a new product planning meeting, new sprint planning meeting. You add that feature, you take another feature out, and then we're going to start over. So you either let us go to the end of this sprint and then add the feature, or face the consequences. And that worked for him because of his personality. Also because in those days, the kind of projects that tried Agile tended to be ones that were in such trouble that they were willing to be kind of hands-off in management. By the way, Ken Schwaber has a book on Scrum. It's from Microsoft Press that hasn't got a lot, it's not very well known, and I can look up the book because it's not coming to mind, but it's essentially a set of case studies of Scrum projects and how he handled problems in Scrum projects. So people might find better advice than mine in there.
I think the book is called, I may be wrong, I do recall a book. I had it in the library in one of the companies I worked for. I think it's called Project Management with Scrum. I may be wrong, but it sounds
right. All I remember is a gray cover.
Yeah, a gray cover. That's also what I remember. Brian, thank you very much. It's been again a pleasure to have you with us today. It's been a long day for everyone, so time to wrap up. On behalf of Agile Lithuania community, big thank you.